Hi folks, how's it going? Day 17, hour 412 of exploring these issues. Not quite, right? I hope we had good conversations today as you explored the issues of ethics through your papers. And we'll take the next step now by hearing the thoughts of Professor Alison Bailey, who will share some thoughts on a wonderful topic, exploring the intersection of a very important issue in our society about speech and different kinds of speech, including hate speech, and explore it through an ethical and philosophical lens. Here to introduce Professor Bailey is Professor at DePauw, Professor Jen Everett from the Philosophy Department. Jen?
I'm going to go ahead and use that microphone, mainly because I think there's recording going on, and so that my voice will be heard that way. Thank you for being here. This is such a wonderful tradition that we have at the Institute now. What is this, our fourth year? And it's starting to feel like we do this all the time, and it's getting comfortable. So welcome for those of you who are here joining us for the first time. I looked back this afternoon at the call for papers that we sent out for this year's Undergraduate Ethics Symposium. And each year we kind of, on the committee, as we form that call for papers and say, what are we looking for? Who are we trying to invite? What kind of papers do we want to, and projects do we want to bring? We agonize a little bit about how we word that, because while we want to have some unity to the symposium, some common terrain among the visiting speakers, we also want to describe the theme and terrain in a way that doesn't unduly narrow the field, right? So there are certain things we're interested in and talking about, but we don't want people who are not writing specifically on that in their classes not to apply to this great symposium. So this year it looked like this. The invitation, the call for papers. Although students may write about any ethical issue, this year we especially encourage submissions focusing on personal morality, as well as environmental ethics, biomedical ethics, media ethics, feminist ethics, and diversity. So kind of covering all the bases. We're especially interested in personal morality, but all these other things might work too. And personal morality is the tricky term here. It might sound like an invitation for papers and presentations and creative works in which each person is articulating her own personal morality in a kind of this I believe sense, where what's great about those kind of endeavors is just the project of formulating what your convictions are, not the project so much of criticizing one another's convictions. That's a good thing to do. But those kind of articulations are worthwhile for their own sake. This isn't what we had in mind for this theme. Instead, we were especially interested in exploring the implications of the big moral issues of our time, and those involving the environment or healthcare, media, race, and so on, the implications of those issues for us as individuals, as well as, of course, exploring those big moral issues on their own terms. It's difficult and controversial, for sure, to try to figure out what should be done on a policy level about something like, say, global warming, institutional racism, international adoption, sexting, all these issues in all these areas. But even when we've developed a relatively firm conviction about those issues on a political scale, the question, what does this mean for me in my life, remains unanswered. So to take racism, for example, practically every person of goodwill can say it's insidious, it's pervasive, it's institutional, it's shaping our culture, our economy, and our democracy. But each such person can also say, but I'm not personally responsible for it. I didn't cause it. Nothing I do in my personal life is going to bring an end to this systematic kind of injustice. And that's true in a narrow kind of causal sense. But is it the end of the story from a moral point of view? Does it mean that we're all just sort of off the hook when the big injustices and sort of problems of our time are on the screen? And that's the sense of personal morality that I think we had in mind when we constructed our call for papers. So our speaker this afternoon, Alison Bailey, has been confronting this kind of question in the context of white privilege for over a decade, and has already become one of the most important, if tragically lonely, voices in the field of philosophy, challenging white individuals to interrogate privileged identities. Her 1999 paper, Despising an Identity They Taught Me to Claim, delivered a rare personal philosophical reflection on the particular dilemma privileged, cognizant, white feminists face in thinking about how to use privilege in liberatory ways. And more close to home, in a way, within the discipline, among our peers, the people with whom we work and teach and meet at conferences. Her more recent paper, 2010, on intersectionality and the whiteness of feminist philosophy, Bailey asks why white feminist philosophers have failed to engage the radical work being done by non-Western women, U.S. women of color, and scholars of color outside the discipline. Why so insular? I've long been a tremendous fan of Alison Bailey's work in this area from the very beginning of your publications in this field. So that's why I was really thrilled that she accepted our invitation to speak at this year's symposium. So here's the formal bit. Alison Bailey is the director of Women and Gender Studies program at Illinois State University, where she's also a professor of philosophy. Her research is addressing issues in the intersections of feminist theory, moral and political philosophy, philosophy of race and whiteness studies, and epistemology. Her work is applied with a preference toward non-ideal theory, and some of you will know what that means. Concerns for social justice are driving her selection of philosophical problems, which she then works through by appealing to real-life examples taken from narratives, social science research, and public policy. She recently co-edited a special issue of Hypatia on the reproduction of whiteness, race, and the regulation of the gendered body. And her recent work on philosophical issues related to racism and resistance is appearing in Hypatia, Whiteness, Feminist Philosophical Perspectives, a book you may have seen out there, Feminist Ethics Revisited, Race and Epistemologies of Ignorance, which is a wonderful anthology as well. She and Chris Cuomo have just co-edited Feminist Philosophy Reader, which is a spectacular contribution in the field. The title of her talk today, Shared Responsibility, Understanding Hate Crimes from the Perspective of the Injured. Thanks, Alison, for coming.
Now that I feel all warm and fuzzy, thank you for that lovely, lovely introduction. And thank you all for doing what you do in this community. You guys have such a gem here. I know you all know that. So I'd also like to thank Linda and Martha and Bob and the other Bob for their hospitality and for all the work they did, and especially all the interns. You know, I know that you're a lot of people working behind the scenes to make sure things go smoothly. So thank you all for that. Okay, so what I'm going to do today is try to give you a narrative, because I like to work from narratives. It kind of keeps me grounded. It keeps me in the world. And I want to begin by telling you a story, a Philadelphia story. And then for those of you, because I know I've got philosophers and non-philosophers and people that might not be in ethics, just review what Iris Young calls the liability model of moral responsibility, and then propose an alternative to that, Larry May's shared responsibility, which I know a few of you are familiar with, but I don't think goes far enough. So I'm going to offer a critique of May's view, and then propose what I call shared responsibility, which is very much in the spirit of feminist ethics, and then show you how I think that might work, not as an applied concept, but who knows what it looks like, but here's the sort of thing I have in mind. The case of Billings, Montana. So that's the game plan, and then I hope we have lots of time for discussion. On March 29th, 1996, Bridget Ward trudged her family's belongings into a row house she had just rented in the 2700 block of Eddington Street. The move was a step up for the 32-year-old African-American single mother who had been living in West Philadelphia and wanted a safer place to raise her two daughters. Bridesburg is a remote parochial suburb described by residents as one of Philadelphia's best-kept secrets. Families, mostly of Polish descent, have lived there for generations. Children live around the corner from their parents, and houses are passed down from one generation to the next. Bridesburg is 99% white in a city where blacks make up 39% of the population. On the night of her move, Ward heard people marching up and down her street yelling, "Burn, motherfucker, burn." She woke to find "Nigger leave now" scrawled on her house, ketchup splattered on her steps. Ward's sister called the police. Within a few hours, the press arrived to get the neighbors' reactions. Most media focused on the hostile neighbors who saw Ward as, quote, a threat to the safety that they associated with a suburb where everyone knew everyone else. And here's some of the quotes taken from interviews in the papers. They feared that Bridesburg would, quote, go down the toilet like other neighborhoods when, quote, people like Bridget moved in. They expressed worries about their property values, and many residents blamed Bridget for the recent hostilities, telling the press she should have known what to expect. She should have talked to us instead of talking to the press. They held her responsible for the bad press the community was receiving. Other neighbors acted as silent onlookers and feared public criticism if they supported Ward. Only a handful of residents supported Bridget's family and offered assistance and apologized for the neighbors' ignorance. 2 weeks later, Ward received an anonymous letter saying, "We firebombed the lady on Thompson Street, and we'll firebomb you too. We'll get your daughters. You'd better keep them inside." The crimes against Ward were not unique in the Bridesburg area. An Arab family opening a pizza parlor in Bridesburg received similar treatment the summer earlier. And other African American families received threatening letters when they tried to move into white suburbs in the Philadelphia area. In the end, the police protection, the support from City Hall, local churches, the NAACP, and a few community members was not enough. On May 2nd, Bridget walked down her front steps, threw up her hands in the air, and told the media, "Yes, I'm going to move. Y'all have your neighborhood. You can have it." So I'm reminded here of some of the questions that we were asking last night about how positive corrections can take place in communities, and this might be one where, that doesn't happen right away, right? Okay, so let's take a look at the liability model. In a series of Philadelphia Daily News interviews, many Bridesburgers pressed the police to, quote, find those individuals responsible for the crimes against Bridget and make them accountable for their actions. They told reporters that they were not racists and the crimes were done by a few bad apples, and that the community did not like to be blamed as a whole for what had happened. The tenor of these responses is in keeping with most everyday understandings of how to assign responsibility for harm, or what Iris Young calls the liability model of moral responsibility. And a lot of people call it that. I just like citing Iris Young. On this model, an individual or a collective is morally responsible for a harm when, quote, an individual's actions produce harm through either an intentional act or through negligence, and the individual's act or omission plays a causal role, direct or proximate, in the producing of a harm. So that's sort of an intuitive, I think, definition that a lot of us probably would share. The literature on moral responsibility has historically taken place at the level of the individual, but has been extended to cover collectivities such as neighborhoods, corporations, and aggregates of individuals. The liability model makes a number of presuppositions about how moral judgments are to be made in these cases. First, it supposes that a clean line can be drawn between the guilty and innocent parties, implying that blame can neatly and accurately be assigned. When neighborhoods, corporations, or aggregates of individuals are held morally responsible for a particular harm, they are treated as a single entity for the purposes of assigning blame, deciding punishment, and distributing compensation. Next, the liability model is primarily designed to assign moral responsibility to actions that have reached determinus, that is, incidents that are over and done with and unlikely maybe to occur. Finally, because this model is primarily concerned with assigning blame, moral judgments are primarily backward-looking, that is, after the fact, from the evaluator's perspective, something that's done and over with. They focus on redressing past wrongs rather than laying the groundwork to prevent future injustices. Now, few people would disagree that the parties guilty for terrorizing the Ward family should be held accountable for their actions. The strength of the liability model is in its ability to redress harms simply and efficiently. But despite its immediate usefulness, liability models frame responsibility in ways that maintain the invisibility of the systemic and cultural nature of racism. This narrow focus is problematic for a few reasons. First, the model fails to explore what most feminists and critical race theorists see as obvious differences between hate crimes and random crimes like burglaries. The liability model overlooks the important fact that racially motivated violence often has systemic and culturally enforced backing. To fully address the harms resulting from crimes such as rape, gay bashing, or racially motivated violence, an account of responsibility must look beyond the moment of that crime. These are not isolated events that are over and done with. They have not reached a terminus. If we understand racism, sexism, and homophobia as complex systems of domination that are institutionally created, culturally nourished, and irreducible to a few bad apples' actions, then it makes sense to reframe moral responsibility in ways that are not only individual that hold not only individual perpetrators responsible, but also take into account things like redlining practices in Philadelphia suburbs, the fear that people of color will ruin, quote, Philadelphia's best-kept secret, and Bridesburg's historically white demographic. We need to consider how these variables may increase the risks of violence. So that's the liability model, and these are some of the presuppositions that I think are going to not fit with helping us to understand Bridget Ward's case. Maybe we can do better. Larry May, has got this great idea of shared responsibility, which actually makes some philosophical headway. Larry May's account of shared responsibility offers a very promising alternative. In his chapter, Shared Responsibility for Racist Attitudes, May extends accountability to include a shared moral responsibility for harms, even when a person neither intends the harm nor is causally connected to it. May's basic argument is that community members ought to conceive of their moral responsibilities as shared. That is, we should learn to see ourselves as being partially responsible for harms perpetuated by or occurring in the groups and communities of which we are members. The cases he considers involve situations where it makes sense to divide responsibility unevenly among members of a group or a community, rather than to hold individual perpetrators or groups entirely morally responsible or not. Shared responsibility does not depend upon the existence of a cohesive group like a corporation, an army, or a food cooperative. Shared responsibility treats groups as aggregates, that is, collections of particular individuals grouped together. And unlike liability views, shared responsibility calls attention to the ways in which actions or attitudes of groups can produce harms. Here the focus is not on the way each person, community member interacts with others, rather than how each person acts as an isolated agent. Shared responsibility has two dimensions. So this is this last point up here. Like the liability model, May acknowledges that responsibility, like justice, is sometimes backward-looking. We need to be concerned with the harms that perpetrators either intentionally cause or cause by acts of omission. Like the liability model, May also acknowledges that responsibility, like virtue, is forward-looking. It should take into account the development of those character traits, attitudes, and dispositions, such as sensitivity, tolerance, patience, understanding, kindness, or yesterday we were talking about compassion. Today we were talking about compassion too, so that these might be needed to minimize future harm. In the backward-looking sense, the word sharing is synonymous with dividing, allotting, parceling out, and May wants to retain the sense of responsibility. But the most promising feature of May's view, I think, is his forward-looking account of how individuals are responsible for the character-based attitudes and dispositions that increase the risks of community violence. This dimension differs from the liability model because it expands responsibility beyond actions and intentions to cover affective states. This move is distressing for some because they feel that holding people accountable for their character development or their affective states stretches responsibility to the point of meaninglessness. Nevertheless, I think May's insights are really worth pursuing. In some instances, he thinks that community members' shared attitudes contribute to a climate that increases the risk of violence. He explains, in discussing harmful attitudes, I'm not interested in what may be described as mere thoughts. Attitudes are not mere cognitive states. They are also affective states in which a person under normal circumstance is moved to behave in various ways as a result of having a particular attitude. Attitudes such as racism can have an effect similar to that produced by a careless parent. Those who have racist attitudes create a climate in which harm is really more likely to occur. Bridesburgers exhibit insensitive attitudes when they say things like, "I'm uncomfortable with them moving into my community and experimenting with my investment." And that's a property values thing, I'm guessing, right? "I know it's against the law to refuse to rent to black families, but if they get out, that's fine." By maintaining a cultural climate that fears families of color, regards them with suspicion, and discourages people like Bridget from moving into the community, Bridesburgers participate in something that's analogous to a joint venture that increases the likelihood that any minority family moving into the area will be greeted violently. Insofar as Bridesburgers make no effort to reduce the risks of violence by acknowledging and examining their attitudes, Larry May thinks they demonstrate a kind of moral recklessness. Understanding responsibility is shared then, ideally will encourage community members to develop an increased sensitivity to both their affective and non-affective contributions to community harms, to the point where they may feel ashamed or tainted by their possible connections to harm and seek to reconcile differences in the future. May suggests that blame, punishment, and shame for what has occurred might motivate community members to act differently in the future. And I sort of disagree with him here because I think shame is a really lousy motivator, but that's a different topic. The forward-looking dimension of shared responsibility, however, is a promising resource for thinking about cases like Bridesburg. Broadening responsibility to cover character traits and attitudes gives May's account a much greater explanatory power. Yet I think that shared responsibility suffers from several shortcomings that weaken it as a resource for understanding the complexity of community responsibility for hate crimes like the one that happened in Bridesburg. Okay, so here's some of the problems I think happen with Larry May's view, and then I'm going to talk about my view and how I think it solves some of those things. First, even though May rejects the liability model, his account still buys into the conceptual framework of that model. That is, he retains the language, concepts, and questions generated by the literature on collective responsibility, and its strong focus on isolating, blame-making, and backward-looking judgment. This in and of itself is not unusual. Philosophical projects that explore traditional topics from angles almost always inherit some conceptual baggage from earlier conversations. But this baggage is not without political consequences. The problem with shared responsibility is this. Like the liability model, it has an asymmetrical character that focuses almost exclusively on the behaviors and attitudes of community members who contribute to community violence. When shared agency is defined in terms of contributions to harm, then the anger, frustration, and fears of those harmed, like Bridget Ward's family, are pushed to the background. When responsibility for racial violence is framed as a question of understanding how community members' affective states and actions have contributed to harm, the focus is on the white people of Bridesburg and what they may have done, how they might take responsibility in ways that are designed to restore their status as good white citizens. When conversations are framed in ways that cast harm contributors as only agents, the only agents, then Bridget's voice is erased, obscured, and difficult to hear. The conversation becomes one-sided. White Bridesburgers are in charge of assigning blame, and Ward is positioned as a bystander waiting for their decision. This troubles me. The shared responsibility for hate crimes isolates white Bridesburgers from Ward. Framing moral responsibility in this way focuses on white folks' attitudes and makes it easy to explore the interactions between harm producers, that is, the vandals and the letter writers, and harm contributors, the bystanders and the bad attitude holders. But makes it difficult to explore the interactions between harm contributors and those harmed. When it comes to exploring responsibility across racial difference, shared responsibility is just as non-interactive as the liability views. By framing the conversation in terms of a connection among agents' attitudes, actions, and harms, shared responsibility obscures an important piece of the community dynamic. It foregrounds the moral agency of harm producers and harm contributors. Bridget's concerns are either obscured completely or made visible only through the observations and reactions of the harm contributors. Shared responsibility is motivated by and in response to the sense of shame and taint that white Bridesburgers feel in the wake of these crimes, rather than a genuine concern with the fear, frustration, and anger that Ward and her family experience. The only effective states that enter into the equation are white Bridesburgers' insensitivity to the racial dynamics of their community. When our motivation for preventing harms is driven by shame, then forward-looking dimensions of shared responsibility are weak. They privilege white Bridesburgers' self-focused concerns over any concerns for Bridget's experiences. So now I just want to say a little bit about what that means by appealing to Claudia Card, her critique and some of her observations about responsibility under conditions of privilege and oppression. Card's observations on oppression and responsibility get at the basic sticking point here. What it means to take responsibility varies with one's social location. To understand this, Card asks us to consider what emerges when we look forward and up. So forward is, a forward-looking view, this character development view that I've been outlining, and then up, from the standpoint of those oppressed pushing back. So what emerges when we look forward and up toward a future from a standpoint of those like Bridget struggling to put their lives together? From this perspective, shared responsibility is complicated by the moral damage Bridget and others have sustained through the constant wear and tear of daily injustices. One reason May's framework makes it difficult to engage Bridget's anger and fear is that despite its forward-looking dimension, shared responsibility is conceived from a perspective that looks forward and down. So the perspective of the privileged, kind of looking down on the actions and what happens to Bridget. Although May makes a clean epistemic shift away from the moral, quote, view from nowhere, there's still a sense in which the perspective beneath shared responsibility is privileged. It is constructed from the perspective of Bridesburgers who frame their understanding of responsibility from a here which is shaped by feeling at home in their suburb. The nature of the privileged forward and down perspective is described in Maria Lugone's world travel vocabulary, which is a real handy tool for getting at some of these differences for those of you who know Maria's work well. The nature of the privileged forward and down perspective is described in this way. So when she uses world, you can, without getting into the metaphysics of it, a world could be a neighborhood. So for the purposes of this paper, that's what it will refer to. When we world travel, Lugone says, we experience being at ease in worlds populated by people who share our experience and history, right? White Bridesburgers are very at ease in their neighborhood. We also share being ill at ease in worlds that construct us in ways we do not recognize. So Bridget's move to Bridesburg is a move to a world where she is ill at ease, where arrogant eyes construct her as a threat to property values. White Bridesburgers already inhabit a world which they are at ease in almost all the time. So most moral agents construct their understandings of responsibility from the moral perspective of the worlds that they're at ease in. This alone is not problematic. Difficulties arise when we insist that our definitions of concepts like responsibility, shame, or blameworthiness are not world-dependent and can be easily extended to cover the experiences of persons like Bridget who are ill at ease in this new community. Shared responsibility, then, is world-dependent. The moral point of view it encourages mirrors more closely the experiences of those who feel at home and are at ease in the community. Two themes in May's work suggest this. First, when we think about Bridesburg using shared responsibility as a model of agency, the affective states and actions of white contributors are foregrounded, and resolutions are aimed at restoring their goodness. Because outsiders like Bridget do not share responsibility for the ways they are constructed in the worlds where they are ill at ease, Bridget only becomes visible through their discussions. This focus on white people's behavior makes Ward and her family the object of conversation. But this is just not a no wrinkle in May's theory about how to divide up responsibility. It adds very important questions about who gets to speak and who is heard. Next, May's account of how contributors ought to develop a moral sensitivity to the conditions that contribute to racial violence is unidirectional, non-interactive. Shared responsibility is world-dependent because it requires white Bridesburgers to be aware of how their states and prejudices increase the risks of violence. The challenge here is not with cultivating sensitivity to harm, Rather, it is, with May's unidirectional description of the nature of this harm. White community members are encouraged to keep tabs on how they see and make sense of Bridget and her move to the community. However, shared responsibility has no provisions for encouraging whites to explore how Bridget might see them, or how she might be angered by their self-focused efforts to fix things. Responsibility, as Linda Bell reminds us, extends to the way in which one is seen by others and one's being an inert presence in the world. So I'm reminded here of Bob's comments last night about the courage it takes to see ourselves, and my take on that is it's not just you looking in the mirror. Maria Lugones, Gloria Ansaldúa, and a lot of feminists of color talk about the other being a mirror. Well, so does Frantz Fanon, but I mean, there's a long legacy, right? So if people of color, for white people, are faithful mirrors that reflect back our actions, we're going to get a more multiply rich feeling of what's going on in this community. We're not just looking at ourselves in the mirror and saying, how can I restore myself as a good white citizen of Bridesburg? We're getting new information here. And that takes courage, and it's work that mostly members of privileged groups just don't want to do because it's painful. Understanding responsibility in these terms, as I said, requires a great deal of work. Sensitivity towards pain and anger requires more than examining our attitudes. It requires learning to see yourself as one sees you. So here's one of my favorite quotes from Maria Lugones on this. So this is her talking about the relationships between Anglo-feminists and Latinas. She says, whites are inattentive to our, or whites and Anglos are inattentive to our interactions, the interactions between Latinos and whites. You are not keenly attentive to what our interactions might reveal. Being central, being a being in the foreground is important to you. You're being integrated, one responsible decision maker. Your sense of responsibility and decision making are tied to being able to say exactly who it is that did what, the liability model, and that person must be one and have a good will and working order. And you are very keen on seeing yourself as a decision maker. It gives you substance. Whenever I read that, it's just like, it hits you right in the gut, you know, seeing yourself as substance. Now, there's nothing about May's view that would exclude him from developing a stronger, interactive, forward-looking view. But his failure to consider the details of the interactions between harm contributors and those harmed suggests that white Bridesburgers' worlds are shaped by what Marilyn Frye might call a whitely view from here. The forward and down-looking dimension of shared responsibility is, I think, restricted to the desire to see ourselves as decision-makers and our failure as decision-makers to be keenly attentive to what our interactions might reveal. What were the interactions between white Bridesburgers and Bridget's family? What will they reveal to us about what they think responsibility is in their community, about what they think they need to do to restore justice to their community? Okay, so here's sort of my first attempt at something that might look like an alternative. Margaret Walker once observed that alternative moral epistemologies will not be one of an individual standing singly before an impersonal dicta of morality, but one of human beings connected in various ways, at various depths, responding to each other by engaging together in a search for shareable interpretations of their responsibility and bearable resolutions to moral binds. I want to preserve the participatory sense of sharing that May highlights in his forward-looking dimension of responsibility, but in a way that avoids the non-interactive baggage he inherits from liability views. Following Walker's call for us to engage together in a search for shareable interpretations of our responsibility, I've been thinking about how to reconceptualize shared responsibility in ways that avoid May's forward and down-looking perspective. And I'm not prepared to offer a full-blown theory here, but I do have a few suggestions about the sorts of issues community members should consider when thinking about their accountability for and responses to community violence. I realize this is a difficult task, since listening to what the harmed have to say is just what many privileged people historically have had a real difficulty doing. Questions of responsibility should be driven by more than a desire to accurately identify perpetrators and bring them to justice. They should entertain the possibility of bringing about shareable interpretations and bearable resolutions to our moral binds, as Walker says. So we need first an open-ended account of responsible action that constructs responsibility, and not in terms of liability, but or not only in terms of liability, but with an eye toward how community members might respond to a harm, regardless of the contributions that people make to it. The concern that responsibility continues to be crafted as ethics of liability and control is one reason why some feminists have traded the language of responsibility for one of responsiveness. And I think that's a really, really interesting move to make. I find it helpful to think about community responses to hate crimes in terms of shared respondability, which asks us to consider accountability along non-causal, forward-looking lines. Shared respondability emphasizes that community members must take practical interest not only in determining how they respond to guilty parties, but also how they should respond to those harmed. Understanding our responses requires being attentive to the worlds from which we make our moral judgments. It means being honest about the character of our communities and how local cultures shape our identities as moral agents. It means we have to leave the worlds we're comfortable in and ask, how does this community appear from Bridget's perspective? How can we begin community dialogue on hate crimes in ways that center the voices of the harmed? How can white bridesburgers learn to hear Bridget's voice? How can we avoid white folks' strong desire to move this painful conversation in the direction of restoring the image that whites have of ourselves as morally good people that bring about justice? Shared respondability has a strong forward-looking dimension that asks community members to resist the tendency to end conversations once perpetrators are caught, and more importantly, to strategize ways of acting that are not only bring about justice, but also lay the groundwork for preventing future harms. Harriet Gohlor Lerner captures the strong forward-looking dimension of shared respondability I have in mind when she suggests that the ability to observe ourselves and others in interaction and to respond to a familiar situation in a new and different way is what will give us shared respondability. So the case of Billings, this might be a place where a positive correction can happen, tying back to our earlier conversation. And I was also struck today by Joss's appeal to say, what can we do in this space to cultivate a radical transformation? So one thing that some people have done is be part of this Not in Our Town movement. Are people familiar with the Not in Our Town movement? A few of you are. I know a couple people I'd spoken to yesterday were. This is a movement that came out of a series of hate crimes in Billings, and I'm particularly fond of it because Bloomington, Illinois, where I'm from, is a member of is a Not in Our Town community. So I'm not saying this strategy will work everywhere, but it's something to think about. Wow, here's a case where it did work. I wonder what that says about the community. The case of Billings, Montana illustrates Lerner's point. Billings is a town of about 84,000 residents bordering the Crow Indian Reservation in south central Montana. In the 1990s, the town experienced a wave of hate crimes later attributed to the Aryan Nation groups whose literature made it clear that they set out to racially purify the Northwest by any means necessary. Their threats were followed by violent incidents. Nuke Israel posters appeared in the synagogue and Jewish grave sites were desecrated. Ku Klux Klan flyers were stuffed into local newspapers, and a local African Methodist Episcopal church was defaced. Dawn Fasthorse's home was vandalized. A brick was thrown through Tammy Schnitzer's window where a Hanukkah menorah was displayed. After the first few incidents, members of the Human Rights Commission and concerned citizens met together as a community to strategize responses. They decided that doing nothing was the moral equivalent of creating an environment where racial and anti-Semitic violence would only escalate. So they encouraged all members of the community to visibly stand in support with those harmed. So notice that move. They don't go, who are these? Let's get these Aryan guys. Let's go get them, and then their problems will be over. They say, okay, who's hurt? Let's go take care of them. And then they form this committee. So at every step of harassment and intimidation that happens, the more community support is manifest for those targeted. In a simple act of nonviolent jujitsu, every act directed at a particular target elicited a strong community support for that person or group. When skinheads showed up at the AME church, Citizens showed up at the church in record numbers the following week. When anti-Indian graffiti appeared on Don Fast Torres's home, the local painters union volunteered to restore the house. When the Schnitzer family's home was attacked, the Billings Gazette ran a story on the front page and printed a full-color menorah and encouraged citizens to display it in their window. A week later, 6 homes and a church displaying the menorah were vandalized, but the community redoubled their efforts and stood as 10,000 homes displayed the menorah. The crime stopped. Now, Billings is a more diverse town than Bridesburg, and perhaps this is why their response was more forward-looking and more relational. So I'm not suggesting that Billings' shared response to hate crime should serve as a ready-made solution for responses in other communities. It will not. Instead, I offer it as a clear illustration of how one community came to understand how taking responsibility for hate crimes by moving beyond liability and toward responses that will prevent future harms. They did this by acting with and not independently of those harmed, by directing collective energy and resources into proactive responses instead of responses that seek to vilify and distance residents from perpetrators. They were able to work with those harmed in a way that sent a message to the perpetrators that their actions would not go unnoticed. Shared responsibility, then, requires a more elastic view that ties action not only to individual contributions, but also to community responses that creatively lay the groundwork for long-lasting social change. Shared responsibility does not ask white people to restore justice in the name of those harmed. It is shared in the sense that it invites participation from all corners of the community, encourages everyone, but especially in the case of Bridesburg, right, especially white folks, to respond to hate crimes with what Marilyn Frye calls loving perception. The loving perceiver does not see the other as a constant threat or someone there to fulfill her desires. As Frye explains, the loving eye knows the independence of the other. It is an eye of one who knows that to know the seen, one must consult something other than one's own wills or interests, like property values, right? And fears in the imagination. One must look, listen, check, and question. Liability models and shared responsibility don't do this. Instead, they privilege getting things right, fixing harms, overlooking, listening, checking, questioning. As a forward-looking view, shared responsibility positions community members as vulnerable subjects who are open to taking risks, making mistakes, and breaking old habits. Even if this means we may have to redirect our energies away from finding the people who did this wrong and bringing them to justice, and toward responding to a familiar situation in a new and different way. What if the Ward family had moved into the community with this understanding of responsibility as part of their community culture? Okay, that's it. Thank you. So in the interest of moving things forward or getting you to be more curious about this, Not in Our Town has a website, and they have some of the stories, they have pictures, they have lesson plans. If any of you work or are planning on working in secondary education, there's some really good materials there on teaching people about hate crimes and responses to them. And they're just a wonderful, wonderful organization. They've got a couple films. The first one, Not in Our Town, which does talk about Billings, and then the second one, which talks about 2 more towns, including Bloomington, Illinois. So I just encourage you as a way of getting engaged to check them out. And I just also wanted to show this picture because the menorah turns into a symbol of resistance, right? And so there are all these people, like there's this Crow Indian chief with a menorah, and this Catholic priest with a menorah, and the Orthodox priest with a menorah. It's kind of a cool image. So, I guess we have time for discussion or pushback or comments. Yeah.
Thank you. First of all, thank you very much. I really enjoyed your and I think a lot of what you were saying really it affirmed and we expanded on a lot of things that came up in our seminar session.
Oh, fantastic. Okay.
But I have one thing that you mentioned towards the end, like needing to not see the other as a threat.
Mm-hmm.
But I kind of see still a missing piece.
Okay, good.
And I'm curious on what your perspective is on it and like how we fit that in there, but because I think that understanding how to respond as a community requires us to also understand like why we're having to respond in the first place.
Yeah,
like,
good.
Why are these crimes committing and be taking place? And it's because we do view the other as a threat.
Yes.
So what do you think is why? I could ask you, why do you think that we view the other as a threat? Like in the case of the community in Philadelphia or North
Okay.
why is the other the threat? But also, what do you think the importance is of understanding, like why individuals we view the other as a threat, and like, what role does developing that understanding have in moving forward?
Okay, so your question, it sounds like you're saying, okay, what is this about the other being a threat? How do we negotiate that? Where does that come from?
Yeah.
Okay.
And how does that fit into this idea of shared responsibility?
Oh, okay, good.
How do you fit that in?
Okay, I'll try to pull this one off on the fly, but I also welcome everybody else's input if they have something to add to this. I mean, one response is, and some people say this, is we're just hardwired to be suspicious of strangers. And if that's true, that's really tough, right? Because that's something that we're all going to be weird about. But on the other hand, I think a lot of the fear comes from ignorance and misinformation. And a lot of the fear that's driven, and I picked Bridesburg because it was so homogenous as an example, right? I think a lot of that fear is just, an African-American single mother. Oh, well, maybe she's going to bring drugs to our community, or maybe the property values will go down, or maybe people will leave and there'll be more rentals, and then our neighborhood goes. And so, does that happen? I don't know. It sounds like there's a lot of misinformation here. So, what would happen if you just talked to her? So, she wants to leave a community and find a good place to raise her kids. So, what's preventing them? What part of that community culture or perceptions about who Bridget is? No one knows who she is. Are preventing them from reaching out and talking and just saying, gosh, it's where you came from. It sounds like it was horrible. What's it like to be here? That's sort of a kumbaya answer, but I don't know. What do the rest of you think? Yeah.
I guess I'm like, thank you. I'm looking it from like a general point of view rather than just like I guess I was thinking how like nationalism kind of contributes towards fear of other.
Yeah, sure.
And I feel like a lot of like fear of threat that has been created in cultures is because, kind of, I think it's perceived that, a culture should be mono culture, like, and if that is, it becomes different from others, like a common culture, then I guess that's also like threatful, because I guess I'm coming from like a perspective. I'm from Pakistan.
Okay.
And I feel like at least there, it's just okay. Like what a Pakistani should look like. Like a Muslim, this culture, this. But when there's someone different, from different background, it's just always considered like a threat. So I think like nationalism has created that tension, of like others, and also like. On Wednesday, there was a lecture about radical right in Europe and like how like immigration has, hate speech because of that and all that. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's part of it.
Thank you again for your presentation. I really like what you incorporated again in one I have a book right here that I should be reading for paper Tuesday.
We can talk later, right? You're going to prep the summary. So
I think that I'm approaching this question that you posed from a lot of my work is post-colonial philosophy and working with color theorizing. So that's where I'm coming from. But Linda Alcoff, I don't know if you're familiar with her work.
Yeah, no,
Oh, you know her?
yeah.
Cool.
We go way back.
So she approaches this idea of and we all, when we do critical race theories, like if we can locate the locus, the starting point of racism, then maybe we can find a cure, right? So she approaches this idea by recognizing kind of the colonial kind of implications of a colonial mentality, right? So if we go back to Hegel and the slave master dynamics of power dynamics, of kind of having inherited a consciousness that is or a system that is dependent on viewing the other as the other, then we have a whole society and a whole culture that is literally sitting on this idea of we have to have the other in order to be people of substance, right? Like Maria said. So we have this idea, we inherit that, right? We inherit seeing race because the society, a very Eurocentric Western culture its existence depends on that. So then a lot of, my kind of attempt to deconstruct, to answer those questions is decoloniality. How do we begin to deconstruct the very pillars of this society that is fundamentally based on race and fundamentally based on other rising? And I think that a lot of that is having to push ourselves to look beyond a Eurocentric Western frame and really understand the historical processes that have developed nationalism, that have developed all these other things, and have developed things like the Tea Party, which that becomes my question. Can you speak on that? Of how do we start doing that, addressing these kind of manifestations of these very violent and dangerous forms that are starting to react. Right, we're seeing the backlash now. Now, we're not talking about, and I love how you bring these things up because we're not talking about the 60s. We're not talking about sometime long ago that our parents lived through. We're talking about today, and we're talking about a new context where we have all the persecution of people, documentation, undocumentation. I mean, it's ridiculous what we're seeing, but we need to see it, and we need to really relate it to the narrative of a colonial narrative. And that's it. I will shut up.
No, I appreciate your comments. I don't know how quite to respond to them because I'm trying to hang on to a question there. And the whole colonial dimension, I'm starting to kind of wade into that literature. I want to say that it has a lot to do with the examples I've given. I mean, look how Montana is constructed, right? There's like a Crow reservation there. Okay, so those people have been colonized. Look how Bridesburg is constructed. It's a lot of German and Polish immigrants. Okay, who did they displace? So that's part of the othering. But I think your question was about what coloniality and othering and how the dominant identity needs to other someone to give itself substance. And I think that's certainly true. And I don't know if this gets at your point or not, but there's a pattern, right, where people take all the things that they fear in themselves and they dump it on someone else, and that's part of the colonization process. And I think that might be what's going on here. I mean, Bridget walks into a neighborhood, but the racial history of the Middle Passage and slavery and poverty and all that just follows her in with that. And those fears are, even though white Bridesburgers haven't lived through those times. Well, maybe some of them have lived through, right, Jim Crow and that era, but that history is very much present, and I like to say that, it kind of echoes, it's still reverberating through the community.
The Not in Our Town concept is beautiful. I mean, that picture is gorgeous. It's just beautiful to see. But, just as a part of someone who allies herself with the immigrant struggle right now, with the broader kind of town, town as the country, and we're seeing kind of a million of people that ally themselves with the Tea Party, they call themselves.
Oh, the Tea Party part, right? Yeah, I forgot about that.
So how can we mobilize and not in our town, but of the whole country, right? Because it's like, I mean, I don't know if any of y'all know about what they were trying to pass in Texas about, you know, you can be undocumented as long as you do domestic work. And it's like, you know, this is really real legislation, right? You know,
Sure,
and a
sure.
woman, a senator, I think it was, who identifies as a Tea Party member, was trying to pass legislation where it's like, okay, you can be here in this country legally if you're working and taking out my trash and cutting my, you know.
Yeah,
grass.
yeah, uh-huh.
So it's like, wow, you know, we're seeing the movement, and I'm sorry, like, everybody here that identifies with the Tea Party, this is my voice, annoying voice, right?
It's not annoying, it's a good annoying voice.
But it's just kind of like, how can I say, and you know, I hear everybody kind of laugh about it, like, oh, these Tea Party people are crazy, but it's translating into, they're moving into office.
Yes,
It's
yes.
translating into they're running a presidential candidate. It's translating into these very scary things.
It is,
How do
it
we
is.
mobilize and say, not in our town, right? And how do we deconstruct this like now? Because there's a sense of urgency, right? There's not a sense of like, well, maybe in 20 years we can publish a book about this. You know what I'm saying?
Right, right.
You know, not to bash on the academics, right? But it's like, come on. let's get
No,
this.
we do need to get out of the ivory tower more. It's like, we do. I don't know what to do with the Tea Party. You know, if I did, I probably wouldn't be standing here. I just don't know. I'm very scared of them, and they haven't quite made it into they're in Bloomington, but they're not like a force to be reckoned with yet. So they're on my radar, but I don't know how, and I'm thinking very locally, right? I don't live in Texas, so I don't know how, I can't really speak to that. So I'm sorry, I don't have a real good answer, but anybody else had encounters with Tea Party people and have some nonviolent responses that we could draw on here?
I don't know if I'd have a response, but I'm from South Carolina. The Tea Party actually is like a large political group in South Carolina, and a couple months ago they had marches where they held like the "Don't Tread on Me" snake. Actually, that flag flies in like every other house in South Carolina. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
Yeah.
So, and I guess I was lucky. I was in the school I went to was, I attended a half-day school. It's called the Fine Arts Center in high school. And the people there were like a huge mix. You had like the classical musicians, you had the theater students, the art students. So the people I was surrounded by were not as, I guess, closed-minded, because we had to try to deal with each other. A bunch of artists in one school, you have to be open-minded. But when we hear about the Tea Party, people didn't know how to react. It's because it's almost like we always hear the loudest. And I don't feel like a lot of people feel the same way as the Tea Party, but it's because they don't have something they can identify with. And I don't know if like maybe a way to combat it is to find something that you can identify with, is because it's like the people who are the loudest, who have like the most extreme, are the ones you hear the most about. And so maybe you could find like a unifying, something that goes across party lines, Democrat, Republican, liberal, conservative. You can find something to sort of rally around, and that doesn't have like a party label with it, you know, like budget, there's Social Security, health care. Then maybe you can combat stuff like the Tea Party. But until you can find an issue where you can get people to not worry about party lines, because that's why the Tea Party is successful. That is why they're able to be so loud and no one says, you know, be quiet. It's because there's not something that the middlemen can rally around. That's why.
And you raised a really interesting point about, you know, how do you talk to folks that, well, the Tea Party is a very mixed party. I don't think you can paint them all with the same brush. There's the real intellectuals like Randy Barnett, who's arguing before the Senate on libertarian grounds, trying to get rid of Obamacare. And then there's the people that, some people, it's like, oh, these are just crazy people who need a new identity now that Obama's in office. So how do you talk to someone who doesn't have it right the first time? My big thing with the Tea Party is you look out and I say, who's not here? You know? And it's mainly white people my age who should be worried about health care for everybody. But it sounds like it's just for them. And I don't quite get that. So I don't know what common ground I can get on them with. I just don't know. Anybody else?
Oh, this is different from the Tea Party question.
Okay, you want to move on? All right.
No, it's okay, I was just wondering how people.
I'm not keeping track of order here, so who's next? Oh, there's 2 mics. Wait, this is complicated. Okay, go ahead, Stephen.
Yeah, thank you. This is going to change gears a little bit. You mentioned at the end of your talk that this Billings, Montana case probably wouldn't be a helpful model in looking forward with this, what we discovered as shared responsibility. I'm wondering if your model that you're suggesting could work, or if you think that it could work, if the perpetrators of a hate crime are not a peripheral group like the Ku Klux Klan is, but if it's more a mainstream group, perhaps like the story that you shared at the beginning. I think you're kind of suggesting that. I guess it's just a point of way of asking.
Yeah. So how would the shared responsibility work in a case like Bridesburg, where there's just, a few bad apples, so to speak?
Right, and I guess, do you think that people might be able to buy into this idea when it's not clear where the liability is falling? Because I think one reason it was so perhaps likely that the community was able to rise against these hate crimes by the Ku Klux Klan.
Yeah.
It was clear who was at fault.
Yeah, and they're definitely bad.
Yeah.
Right, they're just not a bunch of good old boys who are out just to spray some nasty things on someone's house.
Right. Yeah.
I can't tell you exactly, but I can tell you, one way into it, and that is you go to the harmed first. That's what Billings did. So what if members of the community and communities of faith in the Philadelphia area went to Bridget and said, what do you need? Tell us what you're feeling. Are you safe? Do you need people to stand outside your door at night? Do you need people to look after your kids so that they're safe when you're at work? This is what Ann Braden did, if you remember Ann Braden's work in the Civil Rights Movement, is when she actually almost went to jail for sedition in the state of Kentucky, right? Because she sold a house to a black family in a white neighborhood. But she and her husband and their family sat on people's front porches at night when the Wades moved into the community, and they're like, if they want to get to you, they have to get past us. What if that had happened? And then all of a sudden there's visible support, and maybe some of the people that are the bystanders or the onlookers are like, oh, well, there's a point for me to go to. There are people they're invested in getting to know Bridget and seeing what her needs are. And then you can grow a movement from there. But that's all I can imagine at that point.
I can go.
Okay.
Well, I have to make a difference, and I can respond to that, I guess. I think that, I'm not sure if you're doing this, but I think that what we might be doing is oversimplifying it a little bit, and I think that probably part of the reason that we have so much trouble with kind of oppression and hate crimes is it's not just, I feel like it's not just white people not liking black people.
Right.
And that is why, the Ku Klux Klan and stuff like that
Yeah.
is much easier to respond to.
And easier to use them as examples too. So you're right.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
correct.
So let's complicate this.
Examples.
Good.
Well, I wanted you to talk about maybe what you think about Fred Phelps a little bit, because are you familiar?
Well, yeah, I actually lived in Colorado for a while, so he used to show up regularly at the courthouse in the community. Okay.
But,
So yes, I know him.
I don't know, there was dramatic events recently with, I think someone tried to sue him and it didn't work. But I was just wondering to what extent do you think that maybe that could be a rallying force to have someone who embodies so much of the absurdity of hate crimes? And if that, I almost wonder sometimes if that doesn't just, it kind of makes us realize how absurd it is and bond over that.
Okay, so Fred Phelps, I'm also thinking of this Quran burning too, right, that recently happened. Well, Fred Phelps, should I tell a Fred Phelps story? Well, in Bloomington, there was someone like Fred Phelps. Bloomington is sort of the birthplace of the American Nazi Party, oddly enough. And there were a lot of white supremacists in Peoria too, but they don't identify as such. And there are people that subscribe to their beliefs but don't affiliate with this, with the World Church of the Creator, I think is Matt Hale's group. So they came to our community and did things very similar to Phelps. So they wanted to, have a meeting in the public library, and they wanted to just, talk about racial justice and the coming white world and all this stuff. And there was a big decision in the Not in Our Town movement about, do we go and do some symbolic resistance there, or do we just ignore the guy? Do we call the library and say, how dare you have this guy? No, because it's a public space. And so in the end, we just decided, what you put energy into grows. So we decided not to show up. And it got press coverage, and then he was like, oh, I'm not getting, because a lot of times these people want press, and they want to be in the center of attention, and they want controversy, they feed off it. So, what if he gave a speech and no one showed up? It might be something in the paper, and then it's like, well, I'm not going to try Bloomington again. Does that answer your question in a way? Okay. All right. Okay, I guess it's Josh, and then 2 hands in the back.
My question is kind of about the way the discussion is structured, because I wonder if focusing on hate crimes is almost inevitably focused on the harm producers rather than the people that are experiencing crimes, because when I think about the many nuanced forms of violence that people experience every day, I think that hate crime is like a legally defined thing, meaning that there's some sort of a structure saying that this crossed a line into violence, and so saying that there is this distinction point at which point we should talk to the community might, I don't know, might in this tricky way prevent a sort of, I guess, equal engagement from the start by saying that engagement should only happen after an act has occurred, and we would define what an act is.
Right, that's why the forward-looking dimension, right? This idea of you try to leave your community in a place that's sort of been inoculated for future violence. But I take your point that, a lot of hostility is what sociologists call microaggressions. And so how do you work on those? How can you be responsible for microaggressions, or having a community where you have an attitude where microaggressions can flourish? That's tough, because a lot of times, especially people that aren't the victims of microaggressions, we don't see them. We just don't. So, one thing in Bloomington that's happening is that the Not in Our Town people are having study circles where these things are discussed and making that stuff visible in our YWCA. And I never thought this would happen, but the YWCA is the most radical organization in our community. They are just incredible. And so they do all these, anti-violence, anti-sexism, anti-racism, et cetera, study tables, and try to go into communities where there's tensions and have these conversations, is a way of inoculating it. And is it a lot of work? Yeah. Is it tough work to do? Is it exhausting? Yeah. But I don't know any quick fix to this.
Yeah, I know someone brought this up earlier, and so I apologize for getting back to it, but my question relates again to what do you do when you can't necessarily identify the group that is causing the harm, in the sense of, especially in our new technological age where there are all these hate crimes happening on the internet, like internet hate speech. And you can't necessarily identify that group if it's occurring through a chat room, etc. And then you can't even really respond to the harm, in the sense of if it's happening over the internet, you can't go and sit on a porch.
I see. Okay. Wow. I hadn't thought about that. So the perpetrator and the person harmed are, in a sense, not virtual, but their presence. All this is happening in a virtual space.
It's happening. They're using the internet as a vehicle, basically. And so how do you? Yeah.
Wow. it's a different generation, isn't it? It's just something just like, whoa, I sort of knew this is going on, but I'm thinking, is there a technical solution to this? Is there a way to, can you fight viral or virtual fire with fire and put up support sites, or have people flood their inboxes with positive support and solidarity messages? I don't know.
Yeah, no, I was thinking the same thing.
Are there instances where this has happened, where people have responded in positive ways? Does anybody know?
Can anybody else speak about this? Erica, if you want to.
Just a quick. Just like, on YouTube is the biggest thing that I see, that you have like young Latino like voices. This is my personal experience.
Okay.
That they have their blog videos or whatever, and then you have people write on it like, take your Mexican ass back across the border.
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
Something. People that are trying to, you have these whole discourses through YouTube videos about immigration.
Yeah,
and you
yeah.
have like these blasts of voices that are like, anti-immigrant sentiments, just completely inappropriate. So I think that it's definitely present. I see it all the time.
I guess a question I would ask is, I take it that that's very painful to read, but do you want to spend your time just, deleting chats and going after people that you don't know? I would rather like go hang out with people and say, I'm going to help you get a green card, or I'm going to help get your son back, or who was detained. I just don't see that. It seems like the virtual thing might be a time sink that we might want to think about how much time we put into it.
Okay, I don't know if even this relates to hate speech, that's why, because I'm still confused. I guess 2 weeks ago, I attended like a drag event, and I thought, it's cool, students attending it and everything,
Right.
and I wrote a blog about it for it. And I wrote a blog about it, and I, put up the blog kind of got rejected, and the only explanation that I got was that, well, I'm not really comfortable in putting, the blog, like that content on blog, and and I was wondering, maybe, I don't know why I'm not seeing a problem, like, is that a problem with me, that I'm not seeing a problem with the content, because I was like, is the picture to expose it, to expose...
Oh, is it obscene or something? Yeah.
Yeah, or the content is bad and everything. And then, when I showed it to some other students, they were like, no, I don't see any problem with the blog. Maybe you can inquire why the blog got rejected. And then when I asked it, the response that I got was that the pictures were too risky. And I'm like, I replied, saying whatever I said, but then I never got a reply back. So I'm like wondering, is that hate speech? What is it? And what can I do about it? Because I don't know if I can categorize it in hate speech, but the only thing that made me feel awkward about it is that, if something is happening, around the campus, well accepted, and students attending it, and you're not really giving it a platform to be represented on a blog. And so, what can you actually do about it? And there's so much, a thin line defining, what hate speech is. Is it even a hate speech,
Okay, so is this is not your blog, this is a blog on a campus blog, or who owns the blog?
Well, it's for the admissions office.
Oh, okay, so it's a campus blog, all right. And so what you're saying is that you had written this blog on a drag show and they refused to post it, or they had some reasons for not posting it. Is that hate speech? I mean, it's an interesting question. It certainly sounds like some kind of censorship, right? Because it's not name-calling, it's not threats, but it's saying, no, we don't do that here, which is a way of silencing you. So what would you do? I don't know. Are there other blogs? I mean, one of my students was so upset with what was happening with her on campus that she, after being harassed all the time, just started her own blog and did a daily diary of the microaggressions she experienced as an African-American mother on the campus. And so her voice got out there, and then she got a following, and everybody would say, what's Erica doing, So sometimes there are people that you just can't play with.
I think we have time for one more question, and then we'll go to dinner, okay?
I was going to say, when we go back to our respective university campuses, we may experience, like racism in a variety of forms or something like that. Like, if we were to experience, a professor or someone else like in authority being racist, like, how would you suggest that we respond to that, or like, what kind of an action do you think we should take?
Oh, okay, that's a really nice question. Thank you for that. So I guess you're talking about, is it subtle racism, overt? It doesn't really matter, but I just kind of have to have an example in my head in order to answer it.
Well, like, let's say that the teacher is giving like a specific student, like more work than all the rest. Okay, and the reason I asked that question is because if it's a visible aggression, there's offices on campus that deal with that. But if it's like what I'm calling microaggressions, a lot of times, this is sounding, it's ignorance, right? Sometimes white people don't know they're doing this. I sometimes get called out by my students on this kind of thing. And I found the best way to deal with it is just to be really honest. And my model for honesty, and this is going to sound really corny, but Lee Moon-Hwa, I just respect his work so much. And he's given me a way of teaching these materials in class that actually get people to listen. So he starts with the heart. He's got this nice Buddhist thing. So, I would say to your teacher, I heard you say this, and this is how that makes me feel. When you give me more work, I have to wonder about what's going on with that? Or if you notice that only the students of color are absent, do you know you're doing that? You always notice when the students of color are absent. Boy, that makes me feel really watched. How does it, do you know you're doing it? Just be real honest about it. And it depends upon the person. Someone might be, I'm not doing that, I'm not prejudiced. But if you start without an accusation and just go, I've noticed this, sometimes that's a nice way into a conversation that can be had.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all for your questions. Mm-hmm.